Montana Territory, November 1886. The sky over the Judith Basin turned the color of old iron 3 days before the storm hit. Ranchers who had worked that land for decades said they could smell it coming. Not rain, not snow exactly, but something heavier, something that didn't plan on leaving. By the time the first real blizzard of what locals would later call the hard winter swept down from Canada, temperatures across central Montana had already dropped to minus 12 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 24 degrees Celsius, and were still falling. Cattle were dying standing up. Creeks froze solid in hours. And inside most of the cabins scattered across that vast, wind-scoured plain, families huddled around their cast-iron stoves and burned through their woodpiles faster than they ever thought possible. And it still wasn't enough. Every cabin in the valley was struggling. Every cabin but one. That one belonged to a 24-year-old rancher's son named Caleb Durst. From the outside, Caleb's cabin didn't look like much. Rough-hewn logs, low roof line, a single chimney rising from the north wall. His neighbors had seen it go up the previous summer, and most of them had laughed. Not cruelly, exactly, but the way experienced men laugh when a younger one does something they consider wasteful or strange. Caleb had moved stones for weeks. Hundreds of them. Heavy sandstone blocks hauled by mule from a dry creek bed 2 miles east. He had mortared them into the interior walls of his cabin with a patience that baffled everyone who watched. Boys building a rock pile, not a house, one of the older ranchers had said, shaking his head. But on the worst night of that hard winter, when temperatures plunged to minus 34 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 37 degrees Celsius, and the wind drove snow through gaps that no caulking could fully stop, Caleb Durst's cabin held 68 degrees Fahrenheit, 20 degrees Celsius inside. His neighbors' cabins averaged 24 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 4 degrees Celsius. Some didn't stay above freezing at all. The difference was 44 degrees. And it would take that entire winter for people to understand why. If you've ever wondered how the old-timers survived brutal winters that would shut down a modern city, you're in the right place. Subscribe right now, hit the like button, and leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. Every week, we dig up one of these forgotten techniques. Real engineering, real history, real results. You don't want to miss the next one. Caleb Durst was born in 1862 on a cattle operation in central Montana, the second son of Elias Durst, a tough, practical man who had homesteaded that stretch of the Judith Basin before the railroad came through. Elias was the kind of rancher who respected efficiency above almost everything else. He didn't waste wood, didn't waste water, didn't waste time. And for most of Caleb's childhood, that ethos meant build fast, build simple, build like everyone else. The standard frontier cabin of the 1880s in that region was a study in functional minimalism. Log walls, a single-room floor plan, a cast-iron stove, or a basic stone hearth positioned near the center or against one wall. The thinking was simple. You get the fire close to where people sleep and work, you push heat outward, and you feed the stove as often as it demands. Most families in the Judith Basin went through between 4 and 6 full cords of wood every winter. For a hard winter, 6 wasn't always enough. Caleb had spent the winter of 1884 helping a family 2 valleys over after their woodpile ran short in February. He'd watched 3 children sleep in coats and boots. He'd watched a woman wrap her hands in strips of wool cloth just to cook breakfast. The stove they had was a good one. Heavy cast iron, well-seated, but the heat it produced vanished into the walls and ceiling almost as fast as it was generated. By morning, after the fire died, the interior temperature had dropped to near 20 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 7 degrees Celsius. That experience didn't leave him. When Caleb began planning his own cabin in the spring of 1886, he wasn't thinking about impressing anyone. He wasn't trying to prove a point. He was trying to solve a problem he had watched go unsolved his entire life. How do you keep a cabin warm for hours after the fire dies down? The answer he arrived at wasn't new. He'd read about it in a tattered German agricultural pamphlet that had made its way to a general store in Lewistown. The pamphlet described something European peasants had used for centuries. The principle of Warmspeicherung, thermal storage. The idea that certain dense materials, particularly stone, could absorb enormous quantities of heat while a fire burned, and then slowly release that heat back into a room for hours, even after the fire went cold. Caleb didn't have the vocabulary for the physics, but he understood the concept immediately. He started hauling sandstone in April. His plan called for embedding large, flat sandstone blocks, each weighing between 40 and 80 pounds, 18 to 36 kilograms, directly into two interior walls of the cabin, running the blocks from floor to chest height, covering a surface area of roughly 120 square feet, 11 square meters total. He also planned to build his firebox, the interior chamber of the stove, with a back wall of stacked limestone extending the mass of heat-absorbing material directly behind the fire source itself. To anyone watching, it looked like excessive, back-breaking, unnecessary work. "That's 2 months of hauling rocks," his older brother Wade told him, leaning on a fence post and squinting at the mule cart. "For what?" "For not freezing," Caleb said, and he kept loading stones. By late July of 1886, Caleb's cabin was structurally complete, and it looked from the inside unlike any other frontier cabin in the Judith Basin. Most of the interior walls were log, as expected, but the north wall and the east wall, the two walls most exposed to the prevailing winter winds, were faced floor to chest height with flat sandstone blocks, dry stacked and mortared with a lime and clay mixture Caleb had mixed himself. The surface of these stone panels was left rough, not plastered. Behind the main cast iron stove, built directly into the wall, sat a secondary mass, a column of stacked limestone blocks, roughly 18 inches deep, 46 centimeters, and 4 feet tall, 1.2 m, wedged between the stove's back face and the log wall, sealed with clay mortar. The total weight of stone inside that single-room, 16 by 20-foot cabin, 4.9 by 6.1 m, was estimated by local oral accounts at somewhere between 3,800 and 4,200 pounds, 1,720 to 1,900 kilograms. Here's what that mass actually did and why it mattered. When Caleb lit his stove in the morning and fed it for 2 to 3 hours, the heat radiating off the firebox didn't just warm the air. It penetrated the stone. Sandstone and limestone are extraordinarily good at storing thermal energy, a property physicists call specific heat capacity. While a log wall absorbs almost no heat and releases it almost instantly back into the cold air outside, a dense stone wall absorbs heat slowly and holds it for a very long time. Think of it this way. A cast iron skillet heats up fast and cools down fast. A thick clay pot heats up slowly but stays warm long after you pull it off the stove. Caleb's stone walls were the clay pot. His cast iron stove was just the heat source, a match, essentially. The real work was being done by 4,000 pounds of rock. As the fire burned, those sandstone panels absorbed radiant and convective heat from the stove and from the warm air circulating through the room. The stone surface temperature would rise to somewhere between 90 degrees Fahrenheit and 110 degrees Fahrenheit, 32 to 43 degrees Celsius, during peak burn, warm to the touch but not painfully so. Then, as the fire died down in the evening, the stone began its slow return, releasing that stored warmth back into the room at a steady, even rate that could last 6 to 10 hours. By the time Caleb woke at 5 a.m., after 7 or 8 hours with no fire, his interior temperature had only dropped to somewhere between 52 degrees Fahrenheit and 58 degrees Fahrenheit, 11 to 14 degrees Celsius. In a standard frontier cabin with no thermal mass, that same overnight drop would typically bring interior temperatures to 20 degrees Fahrenheit minus 7 degrees Celsius or lower on a hard Montana night. The limestone column behind the stove served a second function. It protected the log wall from the intense direct radiant heat of the firebox, a common cause of cabin fires, while simultaneously storing additional heat mass right at the source. It was, in modern terms, a rudimentary heat battery built from creek stone and determination. Caleb also positioned his stove slightly off-center in the room, angled so that the radiating surfaces of both the stove body and the stone mass faced the sleeping area and the main living space. This wasn't accidental. He had watched, over years, how a stove placed flat against a wall heated one side of a room efficiently and let the other side stay cold. His setup turned the entire stone-faced corner into a slow radiator, a warm anchor around which the room's temperature stabilized. He used approximately 30% less wood per week than his neighbors. Not because his stove was more efficient, but because the stone held the work of each burn so much longer. Word traveled fast in a settlement that small. By August of 1886, most of the ranching families within riding distance of the Durst place had heard about Caleb's stone walls. A few had stopped by to look. Most had walked away shaking their heads. The criticism wasn't vicious. These were neighbors, not enemies, but it was consistent, and it came from people whose opinions carried weight in the valley. Hector Bowman, a Scottish-born mason who had been building fireplaces and chimneys across central Montana since 1871, rode out to the Durst property in late August and spent 20 minutes examining the stone panels. He ran his hand along the mortar joints, tapped on the sandstone blocks, and finally turned to Caleb with an expression that combined professional pity with something close to irritation. "The mass will draw moisture in spring," Bowman said flatly. "You'll have damp rotting your floor logs inside of 3 years. And all that weight on an interior partition. That's not how weight-bearing works in log construction. You've added 4,000 pounds your frame wasn't designed to hold." Caleb pointed out that the stone panels were not load-bearing. They were face-stacked against the log walls, not replacing them, and the floor beneath was supported by continuous stone footings he had laid specifically to distribute the weight. Bowman looked at the footings briefly, said nothing, and left. The broader community verdict was less technical and more blunt. "All summer hauling rocks," said one neighboring rancher at a late September gathering, when he could have been cutting firewood. "Come February, we'll see who's warm." Even Caleb's father, Elias, a man of few opinions he didn't back with experience, had pulled him aside in June and said quietly, "Son, I don't doubt your thinking. I doubt your timing. You're spending energy on a theory when you should be spending it on certainties." The concern about moisture was real and worth taking seriously. Dense stone in a poorly ventilated space can indeed collect condensation, particularly during freeze-thaw transitions. Caleb had read enough of the German pamphlet to know this was a risk, and had addressed it by leaving a 2-inch, 5 centimeters, air gap between the back of each stone panel and the log wall behind it, with small ventilation channels at the base to allow airflow and prevent moisture from pooling. Whether this fully solved the problem, local accounts don't specify, but the damp rot Bowman predicted never materialized, at least not in any account from the following decade. The doubters weren't wrong to ask questions. They were wrong about the answers. And the winter of 1886 was coming to settle the argument. The storm that hit the Judith Basin in the first week of November 1886 was not a surprise in the way that sudden things are surprising. The ranchers had seen the signs: the early frost in September, the unusually thick coats on the cattle, the way the creek ice formed 2 weeks earlier than normal. Old-timers spoke quietly about it at the feed store in Lewistown. They'd seen bad winters before. This one felt different. What no one fully anticipated was the duration. The temperature dropped to minus 12 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 24 degrees Celsius on November 9th, and didn't recover meaningfully for 11 days. Then it dropped again. By mid-January, oral accounts from the valley recorded sustained temperatures of minus 35 degrees Fahrenheit to minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 37 degrees Celsius to minus 40 degrees Celsius, with wind chills that made exposed skin dangerous within minutes. The Chinook, the warm western wind that normally offered seasonal relief, didn't come until late February. Cattle losses across Montana that winter would eventually be estimated in the hundreds of thousands of head. Some operations never recovered. For the families in the Judith Basin, the immediate enemy wasn't the cattle losses. It was the cold inside their own homes. The standard frontier stove of that era, typically a cast-iron box stove or a small parlor stove with a simple single-wall firebox, could heat a room efficiently when fed consistently. The problem was consistently. On the worst nights of that winter, families were waking every 2 to 3 hours to feed their stoves just to keep interior temperatures above 30 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 1 degree Celsius. Some burned through half a cord of wood in a single week. Wood piles that were supposed to last until March were running short by January. The physical exhaustion of maintaining a fire through a Montana night at those temperatures, combined with the cold itself, began to wear on people in ways that went beyond discomfort. Across the valley, children were moved to sleep nearest the stove. Adults took shifts. Some families began burning greenwood, wood that hadn't properly dried, because their seasoned stock was depleted, which produced more smoke than heat and fouled the chimney draw. At the Durst cabin, Caleb lit his fire at 6 a.m., fed it steadily for 2.5 hours, and let it die down around 8:30. He'd stoke it briefly again in the early afternoon, and once more before bed. He slept through the night without waking to tend the fire. His interior temperature at 5:30 a.m., measured with a simple alcohol thermometer mounted to the wall, never dropped below 54 degrees Fahrenheit, 12 degrees Celsius during the worst stretches of that winter. On the coldest night on record that season, when the ambient outside temperature hit minus 38 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 39 degrees Celsius, his interior held at 52 degrees Fahrenheit, 11 degrees Celsius by morning. His neighbors, those nights, were averaging between 18 degrees Fahrenheit and 24 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 8 degrees Celsius to minus 4 degrees Celsius, indoors by dawn. The gap was no longer theoretical. It was measurable, it was visible, and it was impossible to ignore. The proof didn't arrive with fanfare. It arrived the way most undeniable truths do, quietly, through accumulation, until it became impossible to look away. It started with Emmett Greer. Emmett was a practical man, a cattle hand turned part-time carpenter who lived roughly a mile and a half northeast of the Durst property. He wasn't Caleb's closest neighbor, but he was among the most observant. Emmett had watched Caleb haul stone all summer with the detached curiosity of someone who didn't want to spend his own energy on another man's experiment. He'd heard Bowman's assessment. He'd chuckled at the rock pile comment at the September gathering. And he'd gone into November with a standard setup, a well-seasoned cast-iron parlor stove, 4.5 cords of split pine and cottonwood stacked along the south wall of his cabin, and the same confidence every experienced man carries into a Montana winter, until the winter starts proving him wrong. By the third week of January 1887, Emmett had burned through 3 full cords. He was rationing. His wife, Clara, had started sleeping in her coat. The interior of their cabin at 6 a.m., she had begun keeping a log in a small notebook, partly out of practical necessity and partly out of something she couldn't quite name, had read 22 degrees Fahrenheit minus 6 degrees Celsius, 19 degrees Fahrenheit minus 7 degrees Celsius, then 17 degrees Fahrenheit minus 8 degrees Celsius on 3 consecutive mornings, each one colder than the last, as the outside temperatures refused to relent. On the morning of January 24th, Emmett rode over to the Durst cabin on a matter that had nothing to do with heat, a borrowed tool that needed returning, or so local accounts suggest. What he found when he stepped inside stopped him. The cabin was warm. Not the aggressive, stove-blasting warmth of a fire, just fed. Steady warmth. The kind that sits in the air and in the walls and doesn't spike or drop. Caleb's fire had been out since before midnight. It was now past 7 in the morning. The alcohol thermometer on the north wall read 56 degrees Fahrenheit, 13 degrees Celsius. Emmett stood in that room for a long moment. Then he asked Caleb to show him the thermometer again. 56, Caleb said. Same as most mornings. Emmett went home and wrote the number in Clara's notebook beside that morning's reading from their own cabin, 19 degrees Fahrenheit. The difference was 37 degrees, and that was on a moderate morning. On the worst nights that winter, when Emmett's cabin bottomed out at 15 degrees Fahrenheit minus 9 degrees Celsius before dawn, and Caleb's held at 52 degrees Fahrenheit 11 degrees Celsius, the gap stretched to 37 degrees. On the single coldest recorded night, minus 38 degrees Fahrenheit minus 39 degrees Celsius outside, the difference between the two cabins reached 44 degrees Fahrenheit 24 degrees Celsius. Emmett confirmed it himself. He'd ridden over at first light, stiff with cold, and stood next to that sandstone wall while Caleb made coffee, and felt the heat still radiating out of the stone like a slow, patient furnace that had been burning all night without a single log. That image a wall giving off heat with no fire beneath it, was the thing that broke through where arguments and numbers alone might not have. The comparisons that emerged over the course of that winter were methodical enough, given the circumstances, to carry real weight. Caleb's wood consumption for the entire winter of 1886 to 87 was estimated at between 2 and 2.5 cords of seasoned hardwood, primarily cottonwood and some pine. His neighbors, in cabins of comparable size and similar log construction, averaged between 4.5 and 6 cords for the same period. 2 families burned through their entire supply before the Chinook arrived in late February and had to rely on greenwood and dried cattle dung as supplemental fuel for the final weeks. The interior temperature performance was equally stark. Based on the informal records kept by Emmett Greer's wife Clara, the most complete account that survived, referenced in at least 2 later county histories, Caleb's cabin maintained a morning low temperature, measured before the first fire of the day, that averaged 14 degrees Fahrenheit to 18 degrees Fahrenheit, 8 degrees Celsius to 10 degrees Celsius, warmer than comparable neighboring cabins throughout the core of the winter. On peak cold nights, that gap widened to the 37 to 44 degrees Fahrenheit, 21 to 24 degrees Celsius, range that became the figure most associated with his name in later retellings. There was one more number that struck people perhaps more than any other: fire duration. Caleb fed his stove an average of 2.5 to 3 hours per day, split across morning and evening burns. His neighbors, by comparison, were maintaining near-continuous fires on the worst nights, stoking every 2 to 3 hours around the clock. The physical toll of that alone, the interrupted sleep, the exhaustion, the exposure every time someone had to go out to the woodpile in minus 30 degree F, minus 34 degrees Celsius, air was not a small thing. It was the kind of accumulated drain that made a hard winter genuinely dangerous beyond just the cold itself. Caleb slept 7 hours a night. His would lasted the season with cord and a half to spare. When Emmett Greer began telling people what he'd seen and measured, the reaction in the valley shifted. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in the way that communities absorb information that contradicts what they thought they knew. Slowly, with a certain amount of quiet renegotiation happening inside people before anything was said out loud. Hector Bowman, the mason who had predicted damp rot and structural failure, rode out to the Durst cabin a second time in early March, after the worst of the winter had passed. He spent considerably longer than 20 minutes examining the stone panels this time. He checked the mortar joints, looked at the air gaps behind the panels, examined the floor logs at the base of the stone face for any sign of moisture damage. There was none. Bowman didn't apologize. Men like Bowman rarely did. But he asked Caleb, in some detail, about the lime and clay mortar mixture he had used, about the thickness of the air channel behind the panels, about the depth of the stone footings under the interior walls. He took notes on a folded piece of paper he kept in his coat pocket. He left without saying much. By the following summer, the summer of 1887, Hector Bowman had incorporated stone mass interior paneling into a fireplace rebuild he completed for a family in the next valley. The panels were thinner than Caleb's, and the coverage less extensive, but the principle was identical. When a neighbor asked Bowman where he'd gotten the idea, he said he'd seen something similar in European practice. Caleb heard about it secondhand and didn't say a word about it. He had never been trying to prove anything to Bowman. The spread of the technique through the Judith Basin was organic and uneven, the way all genuinely useful ideas travel through tight-knit rural communities, not through advocacy or argument, but through observation and imitation. People saw what worked. They copied the parts they understood, adapted the parts they didn't, and dropped the parts that seemed too labor-intensive for their situation. By the winter of 1888, at least 7 cabins within a 15-mile radius of the Durst property had incorporated some form of interior stone mass, ranging from a full sandstone wall panel, like Caleb's original design, to something as simple as a stacked stone backing wall behind an existing stove. Not all of them performed as dramatically as Caleb's setup. Mass without proper positioning relative to the fire and the living space is less effective. The location matters as much as the quantity of stone. But even partial implementations made a measurable difference in wood consumption and overnight temperature retention, and that was enough for word to keep spreading. By the mid-1890s, according to references in a Lewistown area county history published in 1903, the practice of incorporating interior stone mass into new cabin construction had become common enough in certain parts of central Montana that it was no longer considered unusual. A technique that had been called a waste of time in the summer of 1886 had, within a decade, become something close to received wisdom. The man who started it, a rancher's son with a German pamphlet and a mule cart full of creek stone, was by then running his own cattle operation on the same land. He had expanded the cabin twice. The original sandstone panels were still in the north and east walls, still doing their work, still holding heat long after the fire died down. He had never named the technique. He had never written about it. He had never stood in front of a crowd and explained the physics of thermal mass or the principle of warm speech room. He had just built something that worked. And in the end, the winter had explained it better than he ever could have. There is a temptation, when we look back at stories like this one, to frame them as battles between ignorance and genius, the lone visionary against the closed-minded crowd. That framing is satisfying, but it misses something important. Hector Bowman wasn't a fool. He was a skilled craftsman with 15 years of legitimate experience, asking legitimate questions about moisture and structural load. Caleb's father, Elias, wasn't wrong to value practical certainty over theoretical promise. The neighbors who laughed at the rock hauling weren't cruel. They were busy, rational people working from everything they knew. What Caleb had that they didn't wasn't intelligence. It was a single piece of information they hadn't encountered. The principle that dense stone could act as a thermal battery, storing the energy of short, hot fire and releasing it slowly over many hours. He had read it in a second-hand pamphlet printed for German farmers. He had understood it immediately because he had spent a winter watching children sleep in their coats. He had built it because he was too stubborn or too clear-eyed to let the gap between what he knew and what he'd built stay open. That gap, between available knowledge and applied knowledge, is exactly where frontier engineering lived. The men and women who settled the American West didn't have access to universities or laboratories or building codes. What they had was observation, need, and the willingness to try something that looked strange from the outside. The ones who survived the hardest winters were rarely the ones who did things the standard way. They were the ones who asked a different question. Caleb's question was simple. How do I keep this room warm after the fire dies? The answer was 4,000 pounds of sandstone and limestone, hauled 2 miles by mule, stacked by hand against the interior walls of a 16 by 20-foot cabin in the summer of 1886. It kept his family warm through the hardest winter in Montana's recorded history. It used half the wood his neighbors burned. It held heat for 6 to 10 hours after the last log turned to ash, and it outlasted every objection that was raised against it. The physics behind it, thermal mass, radiant storage, slow convective release, are the same physics used today in passive solar homes, masonry heaters, and earth shelter construction. The materials have changed. The principle has not. It was not primitive technology. It was correct technology. And it took a 24-year-old rancher's son in the middle of a Montana winter to demonstrate, with a thermometer and a cold morning, exactly how right it was. The old-timers knew things that textbooks haven't always bothered to record. Not because the knowledge was secret, but because it was practical, passed hand to hand, cabin to cabin, winter to winter, until the conditions that made it necessary stopped being common enough to keep it alive. This channel exists to find that knowledge before it disappears entirely. If this story meant something to you, hit the like button. Subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. And leave a comment below. Where are you watching from? And what's the coldest winter you've ever survived? The answers in the comments are always some of the best content on this channel. We read everyone. The wisdom is still out there. We just have to go looking for it. Educational note. This video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. Characters, names, and specific events are fictional. while the techniques, concepts, and principles discussed are based on real historical practices and well-established physical or practical knowledge. Any modern application should be evaluated according to current standards, safety guidelines, and applicable laws or regulations. This content is educational in nature and does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.